A while back, I heard about a debate that was absolutely tearing through one of the Dungeons and Dragons subreddits. The question that had people furiously up in arms was whether or not in a D&D world could such a thing as a noble king ever truly exist. This question was very much rooted in the mechanical nature of D&D as a gaming franchise. Because despite the fact that it's falling out of favor with players, it has very little bearing on game design going forward now, and all of the ways that it was widely used to promote a lot of very problematic and bigoted claims, alignment morality for a long time in D&D was chartable, mappable, quantifiable, and technically it still operates within the game today. And even if we throw out the idea of alignment, there are still possible sources of like moral absolutes within Dungeons and Dragons in the form of something like gods or prophecies or fate. D&D worlds do operate differently from our own, so the mechanical differences of the D&D system applied to a living, breathing world went up against, well, frankly, like, the history of monarchy throughout human history, which honestly does not paint a very kind or accommodating picture of anything resembling the idea of a benevolent or noble monarchy. But here's the thing, the debate itself doesn't really matter to me, because obviously people are going to argue for what they want and what they like, and they're going to stick to it, and they're going to double down to it, and eventually everyone's just going to be spitting vitriol at one another. This is the internet, after all. We don't have standards, and we stick to them. What fascinates me about this debate, though, is despite operating within the same similar space of a, fantastical, probably medieval adventure, these two groups had entirely different objectives in what it meant to explore a fantasy. And that really makes me want to talk about session zeros, and more importantly, the importance of having conversations like this within session zero. If you don't know what session zero is, it's kind of a pre-interview, it's kind of an audition, it's kind of a vibe check. Everyone sits down, maybe people have their characters written up, maybe people are still finishing their characters, but regardless, before any dice are rolled, everyone talks about what they want, hope, and expect out of a D&D campaign. And the thing about Session Zero is that they are often really important for game. Not only does it help to establish the table as a place where people can feel safe and have fun, it also does set the tone of how the party is going to handle moments of miscommunication later in the campaign. If people are talking about, topics, triggers, themes that they don't feel comfortable exploring, that they don't want to interact with during their game, and someone pushes back against that, it's pretty clear to see that this isn't probably going to work. If you sit down for a session zero and the dungeon master's like, this is what I've prepared, this is what you're going to do, I'm not budging on any of this, you get what you get and you don't get upset, it's pretty clear to see that this isn't going to be a collaborative table. But if it's open and it's inviting and people feel like they can talk and share and vocalize what they're thinking and feeling about the game, not only can it make sure that the game is better, but it can also save the game if things get rough later on. If there's disputes, if there's frustrations, if there's a need to reconcile, having already started that conversation at session zero at the very, very beginning of your game can go a long way to making those conversations easier down the road. But also, Session Zero is the place where you get to advocate for what kind of fantasy you want. And when I say fantasy, I don't just necessarily mean genre. Like, yes, Session Zero is the place where you can decide if you want to have a high magic campaign or a low magic campaign. You can decide if you want it to be very cutthroat and political, or if you want it to be like lax and whimsical. But it's also a place where you can express what you want to be made fantastical. Case in point, kings. The two camps of this debate were operating from very different fantastical lenses when it came to how they talked about the question of noble kings. The first camp was speculative. They were intrigued by the different nature of a different world, where gods of fundamental concepts can be tangible beings, bloodlines can carry more than just political power, but physical power. How is a scheming evil king gonna get away when there's spells like detect good and evil and detect thoughts at first and second level? There's so many ways to cheat death in Dungeons and Dragons, and yet in most worlds, they react and interact with death much in the same way as we do on our world. So that's a speculative fantasy. What doors does this fantastical world open up to this world that we could never have in ours? I'm not saying it's right, I prefer my king's ceremonial at worst, in a museum at best, but I understand how we can arrive to that. The other side of the coin is also a fantasy, but it's an entirely different flavor. It is a restorative fantasy. It is a retributive fantasy. It is the acknowledgement that there are systems and powers that operate almost exactly the same no matter how you slice them. And rather than being beholden to them, we ourselves have power to correct this as individuals, rather than participating in the long, slow, communal, democratizing process that takes centuries to achieve. So despite both being fantasies set in fantasy worlds, these objectives shape entirely different campaigns. And depending where someone falls on this debate, they are going to chase an entirely different fantasy story from someone on the other side. And I think it really gets to the point that Session 0 is more than just a checklist, it is a conversation. Because here's the thing, if I sit down with my party and I hand them a checklist of everything that I'm willing to include in the game, and the results come back that we're doing a high magic, political, heist adventure, my mind can go to entirely different places than theirs just based off that simple prompt. So, two things. Either we avoided this altogether because we were very clear about our expectations and wants at Session 0 about what the campaign was going to look like, the game that I wanted to run versus the game that they wanted to play, or because we already did Session 0, we already feel comfortable talking to each other, and we all feel like we're on the same team about having fun at this game, we're all willing to come back to the Session 1 table and renegotiate what the game looks like going forward. I've had games like that. I've had Session Zeros that I think were pretty open and clear and honest about my wants and expectations for how I was going to run a game. I thought everyone understood it. I thought we were all on the same page. You know, we start playing and things are good, not great, but solid. And then all of a sudden a player comes up to me and they say, you know what, I'm not sure these are exactly the circumstances I have the most fun in D&D. And you know what, it's frustrating, because here I am sitting thinking, we did Session 0, we talked about this, you know, I made it clear. You're almost tempted to treat Session 0 as like a checklist, as like a little signature that says this is what you signed up for. But the point is, the purpose of Session 0 is precisely these situations. Session 0 helped make that player feel comfortable enough to come and talk to me about the direction of the game. They felt comfortable enough to want to keep going, but maybe renegotiate what it looks like. And sure, I could bemoan the loss of once was and the previous social contract we had about the nature and tone and theme of the game, or I could be happy about the fact that I didn't lose a player, or I didn't lose a game altogether, because they were willing to talk, and we were able to find a balance that worked. Truth be told, I don't really have a good way to end this video. This was just sort of my musings about this crazy story that I remember happening a while ago, and how I was really grateful that we have the tools to resolve these kinds of situations within the game. And it reminded me, despite every effort to communicate and consolidate and get everyone on the same page, no two Dungeons & Dragons players are ever going to play the same game. There's always going to be preferences, there's always going to be clashes, there's always going to be baggage, real world and fictional, that shape how people view the specific fantastical made-up scenario. But that's what keeps the hobby fun and unique and interesting, and keeps giving me things to think about. So I'll pass it off to you. What do you think is a question that is often neglected in Session 0? And what is the craziest argument you have ever had about the fantastical nature of a fantastical world in Dungeons & Dragons? Quick one for today, but if you enjoyed it, consider a like and a comment, maybe subscribing. I'll see you in the next one.